Welcome to ChatNAPT with AI Chatterbots Chuck and Howie, another episode for all things metrology. I'd like to introduce my co-host for the podcast, Howard. How are you today?
Hey, fantastic, Chuck. How you doing today?
I'm okay. It's a beautiful day again here in Arkansas. Ready to have another chat with you and share all things metrology. I got a lot on my mind. I started writing down things that I've noticed with the people, and believe it or not, it's only been a short time, but I've already got 20 things on the list.
Well, look, remember, we wanted this to be lively and entertaining. We don't want it to become drudgery where we lose our audience.
Well, I think the audience would start laughing as much as some of the things that we've seen, because it kind of goes towards the book I read, and a lot of the thing is just a continuation of my book that I wrote.
I don't know if it's the older you get, maybe I'm showing our age, that you grow less patient, especially when people do stupid things that are preventable. Let's just say those types of things. It's one thing to make a mistake, right? Everybody makes mistakes, including me. But for people to do things that are selfish and put others in danger, that's not good. That's not tolerable.
Our guest today is no stranger to the podcast community. Our guest today is going to be Dilip Shah. Dilip's been around a long time. He's got 45 years of experience in metrology, electronics, and instrumentation. He is the principal for his own company, equals mc3 Solutions. It's a consulting company doing training, consulting, auditing solutions for 17025, measured uncertainty, computer analysis. Dilip has been around forever, right? I mean, he's done the co-author for the Metrology Handbook. He's been around ASQ forever as well. He's written a number of things. He was huge with that project, with that CCT book. You were part of that project. He was huge with that. He's been very active on NCSLI. He was very active with A2LA for a long time. He was on the board of directors for that.
Dilip presenting and or providing training seminars at the conferences almost every time.
And every conference. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's, NCSLI, MSC, he's a mainstay. He tells me he's retired, but he's like me, that old thing from The Godfather 3. The harder I get out, the more they pull me back in. The other thing with Dilip, he's got just about every award that's out there as well.
Oh, yeah. I thought maybe we talked to him a little bit about those, and well-deserved, right? The guy's been around, not just because he's been around forever, but he's been so active.
I see you're wearing your Kansas City shirt today.
Yeah, I'm feeling a little nostalgic. Yeah, even though we didn't win the Super Bowl this year, we went further than I thought we might, right? Made it to the playoffs, made it to the Super Bowl. The reason I'm a Chiefs fan is a happy wife, happy life. My wife's from the area, and I was never into football prior to meeting her. Even though I was from Chicago, I was really never a Bears fan. I was more of a Cubbies fan for baseball. Her family pulled me in. Hello, Dilip. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we were talking about, your long, illustrious history of contributions to the metrology industry. One of the things we really didn't get into detail is all the awards that you've received, which are wonderful, right? The 2023 William Wildhack Award from NCSL, 2011 Education and Training Award from NCSL as well, 2010 Andrew J. Woodington Award from MSC. There's a litany of others. That is quite a testament to what we already know just from our experience and being involved with you and observing you over the years. So thank you for everything you do to support the metrology community and help new people learn as well.
It's always, something fun that you don't think about. And that's how it's been down this journey. And so it's always a pleasure to help the community. And that's what I've believed in. You help the community takes care of you.
Yeah. And you've done a great job of, putting it into layman's terms for the beginners to be able to understand it and absorb it and retain it. That's really important.
Yeah. And that's one of the important things people don't realize, because everybody learns. Everybody has like a different level of learning, but I always learned if things were made simple for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to do that. And what happens is once you get at a certain level, you forget about it. That even I have to be very, very careful about making assumptions sometimes. And then I always get humbled because somebody asked me a question and I say, oh, darn, I forgot. I should have explained this a lot simpler. So but it's a tough thing to do.
So I was thinking back when we first met, and I believe it was in Toledo. And
Mhm.
you're from Toledo, correct?
No, I'm in Medina, Ohio, which is about 40 miles southwest of Cleveland.
40 miles. Okay.
And I've
From
lived
Cleveland.
in this one place for this year will be 45 years, same
Wow.
place.
Okay.
I have a
Yeah.
this 5-acre property.
Beautiful. Ohio is a beautiful state. If you haven't driven through it, I went and visited a customer out there years ago, probably 20 years ago. And it was heavy thunderstorm, right?
Mm,
And, I lived in Orlando, Florida for 12 years. And you talk about lightning storms. There's some magnificent lightning storms there. The
yeah.
whole Southeast is full of that type of thing. But this was a pretty healthy thunderstorm with lots of lightning. And just driving through the farm, the different farms out there and just seeing the beautiful crops, it was just a beautiful drive.
Yeah, it's like people say, why don't you move? And I said, I'm very happy where I am.
Yeah.
I have all the major sports teams, the arts and everything within 40-mile radius of me. And anything you want to do, it's there. So,
Yeah. So we met, I recall, at a conference. It wasn't a conference, it was a training seminar that I believe Phil Stein put on, one of his last
yes.
ones.
Yeah,
And
that was in,
was that uncertainty training or was that something else? What was the
yeah,
topic?
so it was a ASQ conference, and that was back in 1999.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
And Phil Stein was doing a measurement uncertainty class, and there
It was
was other
good.
things he was doing. And I also met Chris Gratchen at the same time, the
Ah,
first
okay.
time. Yeah,
That might have been the first time I met Chris. I don't
yeah,
recall. We were
yeah.
trying to remember, Chuck and I were trying to recall when we met Chris, and that might have been the first one for me. Because prior to that, I was in the lab, I was a technician. I really wasn't getting out much. And 99 was my first year of getting out to these conferences. And Toronto in 99 or 2000, 2000 was my first year in Toronto for NCSL.
For NCSL. Yeah, that
Yeah.
was the only conference that was really international, that was
Yes.
outside the US, even though we say
The I in
NCSL.
NCSLI.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and there's some important things about that 1999 conference in Toledo. I don't know if you remember, but at one of the evening meetings, we sat together and Chris, Phil Stein, and everybody, and we put the of a basic foundations for the certified calibration technician exam.
Ah, yes.
That was the sort of like startup and get the ideas in process. And Phil
Yeah,
Stein was the
basic formation
driver
and
behind
structure,
it.
right?
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I was glad that I was at that event, and I was glad that I met you.
Well, let's go back just a little bit before we talk about your meeting. What brought you to metrology, Dilip? How did you get involved in metrology? What drew you into the metrology business?
My career started in metrology when I was 7 years old.
Wow.
And so,
You got me beat.
I'm a November child, and so I'm like the oldest guy in the class. So I was starting first grade. I hadn't been to kindergarten or anything. I just started, in first grade. And, but your parents give you this brand new book bag and pencil box and everything. Well, in my pencil box, I had 2 rulers. And the first thing I did was I lined them up. And I found out, that I zeroed them up in the start, but at the 6-inch mark, it wasn't perfectly lining up. And
Oh,
so
that's awesome.
basically, I said, well, this should be the same. And I used to always follow my dad. My dad was a all-around guy. He would do carpentry. He would do whatever, around the house. And I'd see them measure with, big rulers and so on. So I said, Dad, which one is right? And he didn't have an answer for me, but he was very quick-witted. And he says, son, that's why you're going to school. You go figure it out. And and basically, I just was really just interested in measurements.
Yeah.
I always wanted to achieve the perfect measurement. And so, I've seen my dad cut wood, and it'd line up the yardstick and
The
the
old
other
measure twice, cut
measuring
once, right?
tapes. Yeah. So I always had that. And then, in that pencil box, you had the protractor and the angles, squares, and all those things. So I was used to, mess with it, draw a triangle and measure the angle with a protractor and see how well I can achieve the same thing. And numbers, I just love numbers. So this is a true story. And
Well, that's an astute observation for a 7-year-old
Yes, that's
to even take that step to line them up to say, hey, wait a minute, these things are off.
eh, even now, like when I go, to Staples or any, store, and there were bin of rollers. And if they're wooden rollers, plastic rollers are pretty consistent, and the metal ones, the wooden ones, because all those markings, the graduations are stamped in, there's always an error. And even now I say, aha, I found one.
There you go.
Like it doesn't match.
So years ago, we did some training. One of my colleagues and I did training for our salespeople, and he was looking for some examples, just trying to pay attention everywhere he went to see if there were real world examples of metrology that they could relate to, right? Because salespeople are typically not technical, and so he's just trying to relate it, which makes sense, right? He's in the grocery store. He sees an end cap that has hand soaps, and there's like 3 different scents, and of course different colors as well. And he's looking at those, and the amount of volume in each one is clearly different. Like they're not even sitting next to each other. There's some on one shelf, some on another, and a third one on the other. And he's looking at those going, that's pretty far off. So then he picks one of each and he lines them up, and then he goes and finds the worst ones, right? Worst examples. And bought those and brought them in for the training class to say, look, these are all the same price. They're just different scents. They should have the same volume. There's a problem with their fill process, right?
Yeah.
And so that was a good way to segue into the whole measurement and control of the reason metrology exists.
Yeah. And one of the things, like I travel a lot, so I always weigh my bag. Of course, now I've got, the different status with the airlines. So I don't have to worry about that because I can have bag up to 70 pounds. But back when I didn't have that status, and so I had a little balance that, I had calibrated. And I'd weigh my bags, and I went to an airline counter and they say, okay, this bag is 1.5 pounds over. And so I said, well, I weighed it at, before I left. And I said, I'm in this business. And so I said, do you mind if we weigh it on the other scale, or the other counter scale? And the agent, she said, yeah. And so there it was, 1 pound under. So then I said,
And
okay.
these are calibrated scales, no?
Yeah. And because I said, I'm in this business. And I said, which one is right? And at the end of the day, she just let me check it in without paying the charge, because I said, if you charge anything that by weight, volume, length, it's legal metrology, and you have to have this calibrated. And so there were people in the line behind me, and they were like smiling. And so, yeah, somebody won finally that they didn't have to pay the excess baggage fees.
Right.
But those are the kind of stories that, you get a chuckle out of.
You mentioned legal metrology. And for our audience who may not be aware, there are different types of metrology, right? Legal
Yes.
metrology that Dilip was talking about is, again, it's typically weighing scales. Now, that's not all there is, right? You could be commodity exchange for volume of gasoline or fuel or any type of liquid where you're transferring commodity from one owner to another.
Yeah.
But typical things in everyday life that you're going to see is when you go to the deli and you're buying some meat and they're weighing it on the scale, those scales have to be calibrated.
Yeah.
Same thing when you go to the post office to mail something and they have to weigh it out to see how much the fee is. Those have to be calibrated scales. Truck scales on the highway, cattle scales or any type of livestock scales to determine how much weight there is and you're selling the product by weight. Those types of things are legal metrology. And the reason that's different than the other types of metrology, which are scientific and industrial metrology, is because legal metrology is not going to go back and make a correction if they find an error. They're not going to go give you an extra slice of meat if it was off when it was calibrated 6 months later, right? They're just going to fix it and move forward.
Yeah.
Industrial metrology is more interested in, hey, there's something wrong with the instrument. It's outside of what we expected it to be, whatever its parameters are allowed to be. We need to now go back and see how that impacted every measurement it was used for, because it could have a detrimental effect. And that gets more into legalities. So industrial metrology is going to look backwards and try to set it correct going forward as well. Legal metrology is only going to correct it and go forward. They're not going to go back and fix it. Same thing with gasoline pumps, at your gas station. And then scientific metrology is more involved with the definition and realization of different measurement units and the traceability chain. So just wanted to make that, it was a good point that you brought up about legal metrology. I just wanted to clarify that for our audience who may or may not understand that.
Yes, excellent. And the business we are in, which is that industrial metrology, it's kind of interesting because sometimes, let's say, if that balance that I was talking about was something that we were calibrating and it was off by the 1.5 pounds I mentioned, and if we adjusted it. So one of the things that I worry about is how good is that measurement? And that gets into the traceability and accuracy, because one of the dangers in the business we are in is sometimes we over adjust. And if we over adjust, it has got, if I just adjusted that based on that one measurement and didn't look at the whole range and all like that,
Right.
it has other consequences. And for those of you that are interested, you could Google. Dr. Deming was a quality guru, and Dr. Deming talks about this dangers of over-adjustment, and it's called the Deming funnel experiment. So that's something really neat to see, like what can over-adjustment do for you. And a lot of labs will overreact, and they'll have a knee-jerk reaction without studying the variation in their measurement. So that's the other thing I just want to mention, that in our business that we have to be careful.
Wouldn't you say almost every Cal lab does that? Mostly they adjust to nominal.
Yeah, it's possible, because now when a Cal lab has a customer's equipment, I mean, that's the only chance they have. And now, if I was a customer sending my equipment to a Cal lab, I would tell them, tell me how far it's off by. But again, I am an educated consumer.
Mhm.
I know a lot about stuff. But most consumers of calibration services will basically say, yeah, adjust it to nominal. And if you do that, then that Deming's, funnel experiment scenario happens. The issues related to over-adjustment. Because the next time you measure it, it may not be off by 1.5 pounds. It may be off by half, because there's variation in everything we do. And that's part of that random variation that we have to look about. So it's a very fascinating thing that he demonstrated. And he did that back in the 1980s. And he was demonstrating that to back then it was the big four automotive CEOs. And they were talking about, the problems they had. And they say they get everything down to the exact values in their drawings, and they were still having quality issues. And he says, yeah, that's the problem, because you don't know the variation associated with your process, and you're over adjusting without studying the variation associated with your measurement process.
Yeah. In my undergraduate and graduate programs, we studied Deming and Short. And Deming was really focused on process capability and, not just the shift in the process, but the variations in the process as well.
Yeah.
Interesting. What are some of the misconceptions then that these labs can adjust without really making mistakes? Do they have to apply this principle every single time? Because most CAD labs, they get something, they don't have time
Mhm.
to do the research and do the variation analysis before they want to adjust it. Would you recommend that they don't adjust it?
Well, one of the things that should be part of the discussion between the supplier, the calibration labs, and the consumer is instead of just calibrating it or adjusting it to the nominal, everything they calibrate is to a certain specification. So you should decide if it's within, let's say 10, 15, 20% of the specifications, then leave it as it is. And if it's beyond 70%, 80%, then you would adjust. So you would have some kind of decision rules. Now, when I said decision rules, obviously we have other decision rules that 2017 brought out, but I'm
Right,
not talking about that
right,
decision rules.
understand,
So I
yeah.
want to make sure. But that should be the thing because we have this sort of thing like we want to get it perfect.
Okay.
But it's really perfect this one time, right? You made that adjustment based on your one measurement. And I call it the single measurement bliss.
Yeah,
And bliss is ignorance in disguise. And because next time you measure the same artifact and you've adjusted it, now, it's off by, on the other side, it's high by 1 pound and so on. That's a tough thing and it's an education process, not between the labs and the consumers too.
Yeah. I mean, there's
And
variability in the measurement process, and we're talking
yes,
about leading into measurement uncertainty.
yeah,
Good. So we do have some customers at Transcat who require nominalization every time,
mhm,
and they may have their reasons for that. They also may not understand this whole concept of measurement bliss, right?
yeah.
And measurement uncertainty. I wouldn't say there's very many, but there are some. But to your point, then how do you determine what that decision rule should be or when to make the adjustment? Is there a hard and fast? Is there something standardized in the industry, or is it case by case?
It's really case by case. And my argument is the lab should not make that rule for the end user, the customer. And that's a difficult thing because what happens is the customer is looking at the calibration lab and they're the experts most of the time. I mean, probably 90% of the base wants calibrated equipment, which is perfect, meaning, it has set at the nominal value. The other consumers that are probably calibration labs that are sending their equipment to get that traceability, those are the ones that are going to tell you, I want to not to adjust it or adjust it when it's, 15, 20%
Right.
outside calibration and so on. And then obviously it's just not the data point, and then you got the measurement uncertainty associated with that and so on. So, but there's no hard and fast rule. It's really the end user. So calibration labs basically have a huge challenge to educate the customer. And it's always going to be an uphill battle because end of the
Well,
day, they want their
some,
equipment calibrated as soon as possible. And
mhm, there you go.
hopefully, there are no issues with their equipment.
And some
Uh,
customers are curious about it.
Yeah.
There are customers who don't want to have it explained to them, right?
yeah.
What they don't know, right? And
Most
so
customers-
that's the challenge.
Mhm.
I would say most consumers don't want to explain to them. I think most customers just
Yeah.
want it calibrated.
Yeah. Well,
Yep.
this goes back to an old paper, right? Written by Phil Stein called Buyer Beware.
Mhm.
And there's been versions of that have been updated, right? Same
Yeah.
concept, but different papers. But it's the whole concept of, trying to relate calibration services to what you experience in everyday life. A typical example would be you take your car in for service. you don't really know the details of how your vehicle operates and what can go wrong and what can't, or if they're ripping you off trying to make money, or if they're actually telling you the truth. And so isn't it in your best interest to know more? You don't have to be the expert, but you got to know more so you can judge whether or not what they're telling you is right, or whether you should push back against it. Same thing with healthcare. Being your own advocate is the best, safest way to go, because the doctor's not always right. I mean, they've got more education than you do in that specific field, but it's to your best interest to have some ability to weigh it out, right? Same thing with cloud services. You should be able to understand basic concepts. And I've had some consulting I've done, and I'm sure you've had the same situation, where you'll take a look at a cal cert, you'll look at how the instrument was calibrated, you'll point out some obvious errors, not necessarily trying to, be biased, but just to say, here's some things you could verify yourself. And I'll give you one example of that. Had a customer who had a temperature instrument calibrated, had 2 channels at 1 and 2, 4 different thermocouples, J, K, T, and E on both channels. You look at the calibration cert, and only channel 1 and J, K was calibrated, and that's it. So my question to the client was, hey, where are you using this thing? How are you using it? Let's go back and look at that application. And what they found out is they're using both channels and J, K, and T thermocouples on both. So my next step was to say, now you should see from the cert that this other channel is not calibrated at all, and your T thermocouple on channel 1 is not calibrated, but you're relying on those measurements for your product for pass fail. And you have no traceability whatsoever. Nothing is checking that at all. Right. And we look back in the cal history, and it had gone on for years. That's the buyer beware I'm talking about. You don't have to be the expert. Just take a look at how you're using it, and is it covering it? And do you have any questions that pop up? And if you do, then come to your cal provider and ask some questions.
Yeah. And this is where the end user ultimately is responsible for their equipment. And what I tell the end user is, if it's critical to you, then you should do some intermediate checks in between your calibration intervals.
Right.
And because there's nothing like sending an equipment out for calibration, let's say if it's a 1-year interval, and then find out that it's out of tolerance.
Right.
Now you got to do all that investigation.
Yep. You got to go back and look. And that's that industrial metrology application. You got to go back and see if it impacted any decisions you made on products passing or failing.
Yeah.
And I've seen some examples where there's 5-10 year calibration intervals on equipment. Maybe it's lower risk for how they're using it and whether it really impacts product or not. But have they considered that? A lot of times you'll hear them say, I don't know who made that decision. Those people are long gone. And yet they're living with that risk. So mitigating risk is also not just about the measurement, but it's also about the cal interval and reviewing certs and understanding how these things apply.
Yeah. And sometimes, we have a reliance on manufacturer's suggested calibration interval.
Yeah.
And I say, that is fine, but you're not exactly using the equipment the way the manufacturer anticipates that you're going to use. Everybody's going to use it. Somebody's going to use, digital multimeter by a still blast furnace, which has got 140, 150 degrees, Fahrenheit temperatures, versus somebody's going to, use it in a pristine pharmaceutical manufacturing equipment. And so if you rely just on the manufacturer's recommended calibration interval, you are setting yourself up for some kind of risk that's going to come and hit you. So
those interim checks you're talking about, sometimes they're called cross checks. Sometimes I just call them sanity checks, or, risk mitigation checks. And it doesn't have to be a traceable standard that a cal lab would use. Just my recommendation on those interim checks is, when you get the thing back from cal, you get an instrument back from calibration, whatever you're going to use for your cross check, make a measurement right then.
Yeah.
Then from my cross check, here's what it was reading today. And let's say it's a 1-year cal. At 6 months, I'm going to check it again. And if it changed appreciably, and how much is appreciably, well, we'll talk about it in a different conversation, but if it changed enough for you to be concerned, you might want to have it calibrated before you let it go another 6 months and then you have a recall.
Yeah, and there was one time I was working with a lab. We're talking about intermediate checks, and they were doing pipette calibrations, and so balance very important in there. So they say, what should we use? What kind of standard do we need for these balances? Once they calibrate it, and I kind of said in a jovial mood, and I said, well, you go out in the yard and you pick a stone, a rock, and use that. And as long as the rock is stable and it doesn't crumble, it's consistent, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to have a precision weight or anything like that. And that's what I was trying to say, because they thought, oh, we got to buy a, class 00 weight set and all those kind of things. I said, it's just a sanity check. You want to make sure the rock weighs the same all the time.
Yeah.
And first they were like, baffled by that. And then once they realized, like, okay, it doesn't have to be, ultra class weight or anything like that. I say, these are the things you have in the lab and you're doing cross checks. So I like the sanity check. Yeah.
It is a sanity check. So I'll go back to your example at 7 years old. You got two rulers, you line them up at the bottom end and they're off a little bit. So there's something wrong. You don't know which one's correct.
Yeah.
For absolute measurement. But that becomes a good cross check, right?
Yep.
For when you do have them calibrated. And then they're both in tolerance, but they're just off by their part of a minor division that's less than tolerant. That could be a good cross check to say, okay, it's still at that amount of difference every time I check it. Or no, it's shifted again, right? Because you wore the end of it down or something. And so that's what you're talking about with the cross check. It doesn't have to be the calibration standard. It could just be anything that says it hasn't changed.
Yeah. And, I once, like, going through the grades and so on, once I got started, and I was very fortunate to have really, really good teachers all through high school. And we started doing calculus back in 8th and 9th grade, and derivatives and integration and so on. And I posed that question about the rulers to my math teacher.
Yeah.
He was a really good math teacher, but he wasn't a metrologist. So he wasn't a practitioner. So he kind of gives me a quizzing look. And I kind of explained that to him. And I said, look, these rulers. And back then, all he had was wooden rollers. So I say you could take any two and put together, and you'll have a difference.
Didn't happen to have an Egyptian cubit sitting by that you could measure.
No, and of course that has its own set of problems, right? Because it was based on the living pharaoh's middle finger and tip of the elbow. But they were able to still build pyramids, and with the accuracy we can't achieve in certain things.
Why it's called a ruler.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me change gears a little bit here. Let me, Dilip, you're an expert at statistics, and you've got quite a bit of familiarity with PTs. Back in the day, you ran a PT organization, and I want to get your opinion on doing PT statistics. Do you think that 13528 is appropriate, or do you think there should be other methods that providers should be doing analysis by?
Well, the 13528 and what Chuck is talking about, it's the ISO 13528 standard. And it gives you different statistical methods for evaluating your proficiency test results. And it's got a lot of different methods in there. So there's a lot in there. But it doesn't constrain you to just use those. There's probably a lot more other statistical methods in there. So, and one of the things I deal with is I deal with both the testing and calibration labs. Okay. Now, in the calibration labs, from the PT perspective, most of the time you use the E sub n number. And that's like our go-to, like the judge to say whether we pass the PT or not. But when you fail that, then, you have to do a corrective action, and then you say, okay, let me look at it and analyze it statistically and what is appropriate or not. But the 13528 standard has a lot of methods in there, and it is a good standard in that respect. But there are times where you may want to look at other things. One of the things I look at is I look at analysis of variance.
Mhm.
That is a nice and quick and easy way to do that. And Excel is already, has a built-in function to do that. But there are other statistical methods that you could look at too.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I know it. We pretty much depend on robust analysis or weighted mean is our preferred methods that we do. Probably 90% is our the means that methods that we choose to do our analysis on. But we do mostly all calibration is what our labs are. But yeah, testing I can certainly see where other methods. But I'm just curious. You being an expert, I could pick your brain for a minute or two if there were other methods that you thought would better give us that we should think about, and we are trying to make sure that we establish a proper reference value, because that's the most important thing you can do. If you're not 100% comfortable with that established reference value and the associated uncertainty of that value, then the entire test is meaningless, and that's got to be accurate as can be.
Yeah. So kind of maybe let me just clarify. This is from the PT provider's perspective to make sure the reference value you establish for your PT artifact, you need to have a lot of confidence in it. And so establishing that value and then obviously establishing specifications for that. Now, those of you that may not be familiar, NIST has a Sematech statistics book. It's available on NIST website. And one of the things they do a very good job of establishing tolerances for the artifact. Okay, so they kind of go through the method there, and it looks at the chi-squared analysis. So, but that helps you establish the specifications associated with your artifact. You still have to do the establishing the mean, and establishing the mean, obviously the 13528 kind of talks about different way of establishing the mean, and the 4 or 5 methods are also in the 17043. And one of the methods is how do you establish the mean, and obviously uncertainty is the other part that
Right.
you would have to do a robust analysis of uncertainty associated with that artifact.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fred,
Let's get into some fun questions, Howard.
Yeah. Let me kick it off with this. You have been a mentor for many. You've been an inspiration to many of us over the years. And I'm curious, who was your mentor when you were early on in your career? Who was your inspiration?
Okay,
Or
and
multiple people?
you mentioned Phil Stein. Obviously, Phil Stein was one of my mentors too. And those of you, Phil Stein unfortunately passed away at an early age of 62 back in 2004. That was very unexpected in there. So, but Phil Stein was one of the mentors. But as I mentioned earlier, I was very fortunate right from grade 1 through grade 12 to have some excellent teachers. Like I said, I was doing calculus integration back in 8th and 9th grade and science and everything. And then I was also fortunate that our high school had the best physics and chemistry labs. And I used to volunteer as an assistant to set up all the chemistry, physics labs. And
Nice.
so that was good. So
Yeah.
I would say most of my high school teachers was my mentors. One of my high school teachers was my mentor. He is alive. He lives in the United Kingdom. And so I have to give him credit for that. One of the chemistry teachers who was from Canada. But those were the guys, because the foundation is very important in any
That's what I was
education.
going to say. Everything you're talking about there gives you that really solid foundation that everything else you do is built upon.
Yeah.
And
If you have a very weak...
having great detail there and that knowledge base is key to success.
Yeah. And it was kind of interesting because I know in our physics lab in high school, we had cesium, element. It was in a lead enclosure and so on. Of course, back then we weren't very, safe about dangers of radioactivity and so on.
Right.
But that was a level, and it was kind of interesting. Both my sons, were born here in the States, and I used to go to their high school to help out. But when I look at their high school labs and the ones I was in, there's a day and night difference.
Stark difference,
I was so fortunate that I had those kind of, labs with all that kind of equipment. And some of them, was primitive when we look at it now, where we had the Wheatstone bridges with sliders and things. And that really made you more meticulous because you had to just get it right. You develop that art and technique to balance the bridge. And when you do chemistry titrations or like that, you just had to get it right, or you had to start over again.
Right.
But yeah, so the mentors, but more recently, Phil Stein. So those of you that may not know the people who listen to the podcast, and Howard mentioned about some of the articles Phil Stein has written. Phil Stein started this column called Measure for Measure. It was in the ASQ, American Society for Quality. If you're a member of American Society for Quality, they have a monthly quality progress magazine. And he started that column back in 1999. We were talking about 1999.
What a great year.
A lot of things. And when he passed away, I was pretty active with the measurement quality division. I was, in fact, the chair. And back then, he only wrote that. And but those are available if you're a member, all the ones that, Phil Stein wrote and several of us wrote. And unfortunately, I started to revive it recently, but ASQ is going the other way. But it should be really nice if, somebody starts that kind of thing that would be regular.
Well, the things that he wrote about are timeless, right? They're still good concepts to learn from.
Yeah. One of the examples is we were talking about ruler, but the question that comes up is the resolution, especially with analog instrumentation. And so between the two divisions, how far can you resolve, right?
Yeah.
And we say, well, all the best you could resolve is half, whatever the units are, And he had an article and it says, well, you could resolve within 10 divisions, the invisible divisions, as long as you do this, 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 and this. And he based it because it's based on what NIST had done. And he cites the reference to the NIST scientist who did that because back then, that's all you had to deal with. And that's how you got the resolution.
Yeah, that's quite a feat to go 10 divisions between two solid lines, right? I actually wrote a shorter paper on that just for information purposes. But in that article, I write about the fact that if you have one solid line and one imaginary line, you could go in between what you imagine there. And that's about it. So pretty much 4 divisions. And the difference being you could go to 5 divisions in my mind. And maybe I'm right or wrong, but in five divisions, because the value that you end up with for that division might be an odd number that doesn't fit quite right, right? So if you have 200 psi, let's say on a pressure gauge between 2 solid lines, if you divide 4 times, you could end up with 50 psi per imaginary division between. If you divide 5 times, it'd be 40 psi. So there's that one, it would make sense to just divide 4 times, but you might end up with a really strange number that has a repeating decimal. And in that case, dividing by 5 might make more sense, but now you've got to go in between imaginary lines.
Yeah.
And that's about the furthest I would take it. I know that Starrett has had some papers on how they divide by 10 for between minor divisions, but mainly relying on the standard to tell them where they are, right?
Yeah.
Because it has greater resolution. But if you're using the gauge, you can't necessarily do that. You don't have a standard attached to it. So 10 divisions questionable to me, but I'll have to pull up that paper.
Yeah,
Well,
and basically it says about doing a repeatability, reproducibility study between
Okay.
technicians.
Yeah.
And so if you add a new technician, then you got to go through that to make
Again,
sure
yeah.
all the technicians can
Mhm.
consistently read the same number between the divisions.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of requests for problems with torque wrenches, torque devices
Yeah.
from multiple customers. And that goes down to how you use them, right? And trying
Yeah.
to train that. You can't see the value, you just feel the click on the wrench. But
Mhm.
how you apply it and how consistent or inconsistent you are can make a huge difference.
Yep.
well, gentlemen, I really hate to be the bearer of bad news, but believe it or not, we've already been talking for 45 minutes.
Easy to
that-
do.
Yeah, time flies when you're having fun.
I know. We try to keep the podcast between 30 and 45 minutes
Mhm.
because podcast listeners, that's what they tell us they want to listen
Yeah.
to it. So obviously, Philip, 45 minutes is not enough time to even begin to talk about everything that you can share with us. So you're just another guest that we're going to have back multiple times.
It'll
Because
be my pleasure to be back and talk about different things. So
yeah, we
Uh,
probably next time we should make a topic, because today we kind of wanted to talk about you,
Yes.
and we ended up talking about other things as well, but we still didn't get a lot of questions answered that I wanted to ask that were relative to you, like where you went to high school and things like that. So we definitely gotta have you back to make sure that we finish that part first, and then we can explore the other topics. Like I said, I had a whole list of questions that I wanted to ask and we didn't get to it. So just not enough time. So with that being said, any parting words that you have, Dilip?
no, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to be in that podcast, and I'll look forward to talking about other specific topics. And I hope to the listeners you find this useful and the other podcasts that are there. So one of the things is, we are all graying and we're going to fade into the sunset. And I worry about how do we pass this knowledge?
Yeah.
And then, unfortunate things like Phil Stein passing away just suddenly, and, all that knowledge is gone. And that's one of the things I always worry about. And in any profession, really, we should be having some kind of depository knowledge base
Agree.
that gets passed on, because then people take that and build upon it and make it better and better and better. So,
Right. I agree.
I'm with you on that.
Howard, any last thoughts?
Not today, Chuck. I think I'm all talked out.
Yeah. Well, my last thoughts are, as always, it's my humble opinion that proficiency testing is the only way that you can absolutely prove that you're technically competent. So if you're not doing proficiency testing, you're not technically competent. At least you haven't proved it. So sign up for a proficiency test today. So with that being said, thank you to our sponsor, National Association for Proficiency Testing, and we look forward to seeing you on the next podcast.
All right. Thank you.
thank you. Bye-bye.
I'll easy out.